For decades, whether you got mental health support or skepticism came down to one thing: your trauma story, polished for official checklists and courtrooms. But the very script meant to prove your pain was never really designed for you. If these rules shaped your reality, what else could they be quietly controlling? Let us pull back the curtain on how systems built and trapped our trauma narratives. Every major mental health system today runs on forms and checklists that demand a trauma story trimmed to fit their logic. In a clinic, the CAPS-5 interview opens with a single question: name your worst trauma. Every symptom, every rating is anchored to that one event, no matter how much else happened. The MINI, another common tool, asks for a worst experience too, then clicks through yes, no boxes for nightmares, flashbacks, avoidance. If your pain does not match the template, there is nowhere to put it. Veterans applying for disability face the VA standardized templates. The forms require a stressor event with a date, place, and description, as if trauma always happens in one sharp moment. In 2010, the VA loosened some requirements, letting symptoms speak louder than paperwork. But the core process still expects a crisp narrative that matches records. Approval rates rose from 36% to 55% between 2009 and 2014, but appeals still cite inconsistencies and missing details as reasons to deny. Immigration courts use credibility checklists built into the law. The RELIED Act instructs judges to weigh internal consistency, plausibility, and detail. Any shift in your story, one missed date, a new detail, can flag your claim as suspect. Even though trauma science shows memory often fractures under stress. Asylum forms ask for a list of specific incidents with dates and places, forcing people to distill years of threat into a handful of neat episodes. Clinicians in busy emergency rooms and community clinics hand out intake screens with a single line for describe the trauma. If your story is messy, chronic, or tangled, it gets squeezed down or left out. Algorithms in digital mental health apps now score trauma disclosures for credibility and coherence, rewarding those who can perform a tidy arc from before to after. Across these systems, your story is not just heard. It is measured, scored, and locked into a format. The demand for a single, consistent, event-shaped narrative is not an accident. It is how institutions decide who deserves help, who gets believed, and who slips through the cracks. In late 19th century Paris, Jean-Martin Charcot gathered patients in the lecture halls of Salpêtrière Hospital and asked them to speak their symptoms into existence. He believed that giving voice to pain could unlock hidden memories. His student Sigmund Freud carried this idea forward, writing, "Hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences." The act of telling became a kind of medicine. At the same time, Pierre Janet argued that trauma split memory, leaving people haunted by fragments they could not put into words. World War I brought a flood of soldiers with nightmares and trembling hands, what doctors called shell shock. British and French psychiatrists tried to coax out the story behind each symptom, hoping careful retelling would calm the mind. By World War II, this practice had turned into protocol, step-by-step interviews, written statements, and official case notes. The trauma narrative moved from the couch to the clipboard. In 1980, a committee at the American Psychiatric Association met to decide what counted as trauma. After months of debate and stacks of veteran testimonies, post-traumatic stress disorder, known as PTSD, was written into DSM-3. Robert Spitzer, the committee chair, later said, "Veterans' raw accounts forced us to recognize trauma as discrete." The new diagnosis required a clear event, one that could be described, dated, and linked to symptoms. Manuals and checklists followed, making the trauma narrative a standard part of mental health care. But the process did not stop at diagnosis. Over time, systems began to expect more than any story. They wanted a certain kind of story. Elizabeth Loftus, an expert on memory, warned, "Eyewitness memory reconstructs, not records." Yet forums and interviews quietly set hidden rules. The narrative had to be linear, consistent, and anchored to a single dramatic event. That silent checklist grew, shaping which stories counted as real and who would be believed. The demand for a tidy trauma narrative is not ancient wisdom. It is a modern construction built into the paperwork and protocols that now define mental health. Decades ago, survivor movements reshaped mental health by insisting that lived experience, not just clinical notes, could drive change. As Joy Llewellyn-Beardsley puts it, knowledge about recovery is based primarily on the individual stories and resulting insights of those with lived experience. That promise of speaking your truth, of finding power in your own words, still echoes in therapy and advocacy. But the same narrative power can quietly double back, leaving people stuck in cycles of retelling, judged by how well their story fits an unspoken script. To understand why some trauma stories heal and others trap, imagine the trauma narrative as an engine with three moving parts. First, memory. Traumatic memory is not a neat timeline. It is more like a shoebox of scattered photos. Dr. Chris Bruin and Anki Ehlers describe how stress floods the brain, splitting memory into vivid flashes and blank spots. The hippocampus, which usually weaves events into a story, gets sidelined. The amygdala takes over, locking in raw feelings and images. Later, fragments might surface out of order or change shape, especially under pressure. Second, meaning. Survivors, sometimes with therapists, try to make sense of what happened. Is this story proof of being broken or evidence of survival? Meaning can shift, sometimes in a single session, sometimes over years. Third, market. Systems such as clinics, courts, and algorithms react to the story. They reward tidy, consistent accounts and struggle with messy or changing ones. On social media, the market includes likes, comments, and viral loops that can encourage people to perform pain or to stay locked into a single identity. The trauma narrative lives at the intersection of memory, meaning, and market. Change one of those forces, and the whole story shifts. That is why the same narrative can be a lifeline for one person and a cage for another. The real test comes when these engines run in real lives, not just in theory. A veteran sits across from a therapist, hands clenched. He has told his story in prolonged exposure therapy 8 times. In the first session, his anxiety spiked to 90 out of 100. By the 8th, it dropped to 20. Dr. Edna Foa, who pioneered this approach, calls it habituation, the body learning not to panic as the story becomes less threatening. For many, this repeated retelling brings relief, but the process only works when the loop of memory, meaning, and outside response feels safe enough to let fear settle. A refugee in Germany traces a lifeline in narrative exposure therapy. Each stone stands for a death, each flower for survival. The timeline stretches across a table, turning years of chaos into a sequence. Randomized trials show NET cuts PTSD symptoms by 70%. The effect size is large, D equals 1.5. Dr. Frank Neuner, who co-developed NET, says, "It is the accumulation of events, not just one, that brings suffering." Here, the loop transforms, and what once felt endless now has a beginning, middle, and a future. This kind of meaning change can transform how memory is lived. A college student, quiet in group therapy, cannot point to a single moment. Domestic violence shaped her childhood, but the harm came in slow waves, not one explosion. At first, her story is scattered, with gaps, mixed up timelines, and shame. Over months, she shifts from believing it was her fault to understanding the patterns she grew up in. Narrative therapy is not about one big reveal. It is about changing the meaning, bit by bit, until the story gives her back some agency. On social media, an influencer records her trauma story for #TraumaTalk. The first video goes viral and comments pour in, When she tries to post about recovery, engagement drops by half. The algorithm rewards pain, not progress. She finds herself rehearsing the same script, caught in a loop where identity and audience expectations blur. The market, the third engine part, pushes her to stay stuck. Each person's story runs through its own loop. In a supportive setting, the loop can help memories settle and meaning shift. In a hostile setting, the same narrative tightens into a trap, replayed for approval, benefits, or likes. The engine works the same way, but the outcome depends on the loop it is running in. Right now, mental health care still asks people to fit their pain into boxes built by systems, not lives. As research shows, no single story heals everyone. The next chapter depends on whether we let people write their own scripts, messy, unfinished, or silent, and finally, listen.